Good evening, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine. And we have a terrific program for you this evening, focused on the environment. Our featured author, Tom Steyer, is a very wealthy man who went from running a hedge fund to fighting climate change. And he's here to talk about his new book, Cheaper, Faster, Better, How We'll Win the Climate War. Joining him in conversation will be a longtime environmentalist, Bill McKibben, who himself's written extensively on the impact of global warming. And we're very privileged to have both prominent advocates with us. But first, a few words about Tom's own evolution from a purely profit-oriented investor to climate change activist. It was in the mid-1980s, only a few years after his graduation from business school, that Tom established Farallon Capital, a hedge fund firm. And for the next 2.5 decades, he proceeded to make a whole lot of money. And in 2012, he walked away from Farallon and turned toward tackling climate change through both business and politics. On the business front, he started a regenerative ranch to show that you can raise cattle and still have a negative carbon footprint. He also co-founded a firm that supports companies intent on developing climate solutions. On the political front, he created an environmental advocacy nonprofit and political action committee, spearheading clean energy ballot initiatives and voter registration drives. He even tried running for president in 2019 on a climate platform. In his book, Tom explains why we all should become climate people and do what we can to have an impact. This is how emphatically he puts it at the start of the book. Quote, "Climate is what matters most right now, and nothing else comes close. What are you doing to fight climate change is the what did you do in the war of our time." Tom goes on to discuss ways in which we can all change our approaches to the world. And at the end of each chapter, he includes a profile of one or two people whose work has been devoted to addressing the climate crisis. Time is running out, Tom says, even faster than the experts have predicted, and the fossil fuel industry, he asserts, simply doesn't care. It's fighting to maintain the status quo. So it's up to the rest of us, Tom makes clear, to avert climate catastrophe, and he assures us that all isn't lost yet. We still can win, especially given how fast the clean energy revolution also is progressing. Tom's book is instructive, it's passionate, and it's sure to inspire, so I encourage everybody to read it, and let's all do our part to help save the world. Now, someone who's been doing more than his part on climate for years is Bill McKibben. He helped found the grassroots climate campaign, 350.org, and he's the founder of Third Act, which organizes people over the age of 60, I think there might be a few here, to work on climate and racial justice. A professor at Middlebury College in Vermont, Bill published his first book on climate change, The End of Nature, in 1989, and he's gone on to write a mere 19 more books since, plus articles for The New Yorker and other publications. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Tom Steyer and Bill McKibben.
Well, welcome you all. It's always, always, always good to be at Politics and Prose, and it goes without saying probably to everybody here, but worth reiterating every once in a while because I've been writing books for a very long time and watched a lot of things happen in the book selling business. Communities that took their great independent bookstores for granted no longer have their great independent bookstores. So make sure to keep always supporting this place. And many, many thanks for letting us be here. I'm gonna play the role of moderator here a little bit, and to get Tom talking because he's very shy and reticent.
And let me let me say, Bill is very shy too.
The I will say there are times when friends, and Tom is an old and dear friend, tell me that they're going to write books that I wince just a tiny bit. Because I think this does not always end well. Books are good books are somewhat harder to write than people sometimes imagine they might be. So it was with extraordinary first relief and then pleasure that I read the galleys of Tom's book when it arrived 6 months ago. It's a tremendous book, beautifully written. Not, I mean, neither of us are Dostoevsky, but it's
We're a little more upbeat than Dostoevsky.
yeah, you anyway, yeah. But it's a tremendously important and beautifully written book that very much belongs on the bookshelf of important things that have been written about this most important of all topics. I'm going to I'm going to stipulate a couple of things as we start here, at least for our conversation. You can bring them up later as we turn to questions. But one of them is I'm going to stipulate that we're in an extraordinary amount of trouble on the climate. We're not going to talk about that too much. Suffice it to say that it was 122 degrees Fahrenheit in New Delhi today, which is a city of 35 million. That Mexico City is a few weeks away from running out of water because the greatest heat wave they've ever experienced has parked over that third or fourth biggest city in the world for weeks now. The ocean temperatures in the Atlantic are 2 degrees higher than we're used to seeing them, 2 degrees Celsius, which means the potential for a hurricane season like we've never seen before, on and on and on. And that means that I think that we're not actually in a position to really debate the subtitle of this book. In a sense, we don't know and can't know if it's possible to win the climate war at this point because we've let the climate itself get very close to out of control, and neither of us and really nobody else on the planet knows exactly what the physics is going to do at this point, and that's hard and harsh truth. However, we may well be capable of winning the energy war, which is the key thing that humans can still do to change or ameliorate the outcome of this fight. And it's a classic, amazing moment, almost as if scripted by Hollywood. 2023 was the hottest year we've had on this planet in the last 125,000 years. 125,000 years ago was when humans started etching symbols on bone, okay? So it's hotter now than it's been at any point that we would recognize as a kind of human culture. And at the same year, 2023, we passed the point where in midsummer, the world was installing a gigawatt's worth of solar panels around the planet a day. That's a nuclear power plant's worth of solar panels a day. That's not fast enough to catch up with the physics of global warming, but it's a potent demonstration that we may be reaching a moment when it's possible to imagine that kind of rapid, amazing response. Finally, finally, finally. So that's the setting and the context for this book, which is a powerful, powerful exploration of a couple of things. And probably the first and most important is of these emerging technologies and possibilities that allow us to think much more with much more verve about our situation than we could have even 24 or 36 months ago, I think. So, Tom, begin by telling us some stories of these possibilities. You're in this new fund that you're running. uh, 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 profits of which go off to benefit the climate fight. Uh, you're doling out money, which means that every day there are people coming to you with remarkable inventions, one after another, saying, here's another thing. So tell us a little bit about that, what you see, a few examples, what it feels like.
So let me amend a little bit what Bill just said. I actually started with an old partner of mine named Katie Hall, a multi-strategy investment business where each strategy has to be based around climate response and help solve this problem. So we're only interested in companies and projects that do directly respond to climate, but it includes the kinds of things that Bill's describing, like venture capital and growth, new companies, early companies coming up with new technologies and strategies. But we also buy buildings and make them net zero, and we want to prove to the world that doing that makes those buildings more valuable and that you don't have to care about the climate, you just have to be greedy to want to do it. No one else is doing it in the United States, by the way. And we have a series of strategies, all of them designed to push a faster transition, a faster decarbonization. So, but Bill was asking me, like, give me some examples of cool stuff that's going on that people don't know. And let me say this. The cliche in climate response is we're not looking for a silver bullet, we're looking for silver buckshot. We're looking for dozens of companies. We're looking for hundreds of companies, most of them started by quite young people who have technical backgrounds and are going to solve what we do with cement, who are going to solve what we're going to do in terms of grid availability. They're very specific things. But I'll give you, and before I do that, let me make a couple points about how we're doing overall. I mean, there is a sense that fossil fuels are cheaper and that we're struggling in terms of renewable electricity. Just so you know, renewable electricity is much cheaper than fossil fuels. And just so you know, in 2023, of new electricity generation globally, 86% of it was renewable. So when I say how will we are winning in the marketplace in terms of new electricity, the problem is they got all these old dirty fossil fuel plants that are not getting retired. So the question is not, are we winning in the marketplaces? How fast are we replacing the existing plants? And to be clear, 2023, there were more CO2 emissions there were in 2022, and they're the highest ever. So when we think about winning, as Bill said, it's hard to describe that as really winning if your bottom line is actually cutting CO2 and moving to a different place. That's one thing I'd say. I would also point to you today. You know, there have been a lot of stories, and I think the Wall Street Journal takes delight in pointing out that there's a slowdown in EV sales in the United States of America. Well, let me say there isn't a slowdown of EV sales globally. And there are two cars that are one of them I read about for the first time today, which is a $25,000 electric Jeep. That is a change. And I'm sure you've all been reading, that's a bit of an exaggeration, about a $14,000 BYD plug-in hybrid. $14,000 will go 1,200 miles. No. Yeah. So we're talking about disruptive technologies on a basic level. We're talking, and believe me, not only is renewable energy cheaper than fossil fuels by a lot, it's going to get much more cheap relatively. That gulf is only going to grow. But let me give you a couple so one of the things that's true in this world is that 8% of emissions are cement and concrete. And 8%. And that's because the world is being built, not the United States, not Europe, but we're not the world. That's probably I just described 1/8 of the world. But there's lots of the world where they're doing multiples of electricity generation and building things all the time. So there is a company in Germany that uses sensors, machine learning, and AI to basically change the soup that is cement. Cement people think of as like, you think it would be a absolute uniform product. It is absolutely not a uniform product. Cement is made from limestone. No limestone is the same as other limestone. So they really don't monitor it that well. These guys have a way of real-time monitoring of it, where not only can you reduce up to 50% of the emissions, but it pays back really fast. It saves the developer or the construction company a lot of money. And is that good? Well, it's nice to save money. It's great for somebody to invest in something that makes them a lot of money. But if you think about it, they're all competing for business. So if your competitor is saving a lot of money, they can win every bid. So as a result, this is not a nice to have technology. This is a have to have technology. And so, I look at this and say, everybody thinks this is going to be about gadgets, physical things, EVs, solar arrays, wind turbines, batteries. It's kind of like we're thinking Henry Ford. And in my mind, the biggest thing that's going to change this is going to be information technology. That actually knowing what we're doing and being able to monitor it real time, to measure emissions. I talked to the head of a huge company that was just studying their emissions, and they did not know where they were coming from, and they were shocked to know where they were coming from. And they told me that, we have 3 new strategies to go after this thing that we didn't even know was the problem. The old saying, if you can't measure it, you can't. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So from my standpoint, we're seeing places where people are using sensors and AI to measure what's going on in agriculture. So a farmer will know this is my emissions. But not only does the farmer know, but if you're a packaging, company, if you're General Mills, you're going to have to disclose your emissions through the farm. And so as a result, you can't reduce that unless you know what it is, and everybody's going to have to disclose that. And so we're seeing companies go after that, building these information systems, building measurement, disclosure, and therefore the ability for us as a society to strategically change what we're doing.
And that's a very powerful point, that we're moving from energy as a commodity, which is how we've thought about it for a long time, to sort of energy as a service in a sense, or integrating it very closely with. But we still also, you may not want to be Henry Ford, but we still live in buildings, we still get around in cars. We have a lot of physical infrastructure to deal with. So talk about that for a minute. We tend to focus on the new stuff and what new buildings, new building codes, whatever. But we've got 140 million dwellings and business buildings in this country already.
And 80% of them are still going to be in use in 2050.
Yeah.
So if we don't clean them up, they
Right.
continue to be the same.
So, and that's harder in a sense because there's already you're not starting from scratch. So talk about some of these buildings, for instance, that you've bought and are working on.
Well, when we're looking at a building, and we're mostly buying industrial buildings, so those are buildings that use a lot of electricity, which is a good thing for us because we feel as if we can produce electricity cheaper with renewables, that's a huge advantage for us. But we are really developing. At our company, we've hired scientists and we've hired people to study the local regulations to make sure that when we put the buildings in, not only do we get to net zero, but it's profitable for us, because what we want people to see is that it's profitable. We are not going to be able to buy every building in the United States of America and around the world and fix it up. But what we can do is show people that it's profitable and have so you go in, the first thing you look at is, can you put solar in? If you can put solar in and it's a high energy building, you can reduce your costs and therefore increase your net operating income really substantially. Then the question is, can you reskin the building? Can you use heat pumps? All of the things which are not that, it's not, you don't have to be a NASA scientist to figure out. But what you do have to do is be able to measure it, to figure out the costs, to figure out the returns. And then I make one other point about owning industrial buildings, which was kind of what I was trying to say before. The European Union is requiring disclosure by big companies of their carbon footprint by 2026 all the way through the supply chain, so-called scope 3.
And California's
2027. So as I like to say, if you have to disclose your carbon footprint in Timbuktu today, you are also disclosing it in Paris, Rio, London, Tokyo, Beijing, and New York. I mean, once you have to disclose, you have to disclose. But if you think about it from their standpoint, every one of those companies is then going to look at the suppliers in this industrial building and think, we have a problem with our carbon footprint, but these guys are completely clean. So it's not just a question of people's rent and costs. Now it's a question of you getting customers. That's your actual business of getting revenues. That's what businesses live on, is revenues. And all of a sudden, this is about branding for a business. And we think that makes a building so much more valuable, Bill. And so when we look at this, we're trying to make the point is this is not just costs. This is a different way of thinking. You're of a different role in society. And that's what we're really trying to push.
So let's turn this around for a minute. Since we've got your business brain here, imagine, and you do a great job of this in the book, in a sense, imagine you're actually the representative of the fossil fuel industry. You've got a big problem now because someone can produce...
You got to get rid of McKibben. This guy is a big pain.
You've got a big problem because people can produce, as you point out, your product cheaper and cleaner than you can, which should be a recipe for extraordinary failure in the time ahead. How do you, or how are they, because I think you've written one of the best treatises in about 20 pages in this book on the fossil fuel industry, how are they mobilizing to meet this existential challenge?
So one of the things that's true about electricity is that it's divided. The people who run big electric utilities have to provide electricity 24/7, 365. And they take that charge incredibly seriously. And the example they always use is hospitals. You know, you don't want to lose electricity in the middle of an operation, not considered good form in the electric utility industry. But they take it seriously, and I shouldn't even make a joke about it because it's about their integrity. And so the point about fossil fuels, and specifically natural gas, is you can finance it. It's available in size. It is operational today. Banks will lend against it at low prices, so it's doable. Like if we need to do that, and you can look around the United States, and because a whole bunch of artificial intelligence and need for data centers, the need for electricity here is going up fast. And India, for instance, will have 5 times as much electricity in 2050 as they have now. You know, parts of Africa will have 10 times as much. So there is a need to build, and solar and wind are so-called intermittent energy, which means sometimes it's night. You might not have thought of that, but turns out it's night sometimes. And sometimes it doesn't, the wind doesn't blow, and therefore you still want to have operations in the hospital, and how do you deal with that? And that's the argument for fossil fuels, is we're always here. We're in a barrel, or, you know, we're someplace available all the time. We never go down. Now, what is that? And so the question here is, okay, how do we answer that question? Because what that actually is true. Specifically, the big advantage in my mind is the bankability, the ability to borrow hundreds of billions of dollars against it, because there's a 100-year example of using natural gas around the world. What we're seeing is an incredible series of revolutions in batteries. Not just they're down 80% in cost over the last 10 years, they'll go down another huge percentage in the next 10 years, but also in duration. Because if you can store solar and wind long enough, that turns an intermittent power into a baseload power, and you don't have to worry about it. Secondly, there is a revolution going on in what's called enhanced geothermal. And that is a very small part of the electricity generation in the country and in the world has been basically steam and hot water from the Earth's crust. And it goes down only hundreds of feet. And, you know, I sort of think about Old Faithful in Yellowstone. Like you see steam coming up from the earth and you think, geothermal. But it's only available in a few places, and it's not a big part. But in a funny way, a guy from the oil industry using fracking technologies, using literally oil and gas rigs, and people from the oil and gas industry is now going down thousands of feet and is building. And the question is, at a price that seems like, wow, that is a doable price for clean baseload power. And the question will be, how big a part of that? That's clean baseload power, but how much of the electricity pie chart can come from geothermal? Maybe a lot. I mean, my point is this. The hard part about this is that guy borrows at 17%. Natural gas borrows at like 7%. And you may think that's not a big difference. That's a gigantic difference in terms of cost. So when we think about how this is going to go, the real question is not, are we going to solve this from a technical standpoint? We are definitely going to solve this from a technical standpoint. We will solve. I haven't even talked about, there are a lot of things going on in the nuclear area, both fission and fusion, that people are hopeful about, that are very much, in my mind, up in the air, like a lot of technologies. You can't be sure where it's going to come out in terms of safety and cost. But my point is, in terms of silver buckshot, are we going to have base load energy that is clean by the end of this decade? Yes. The question is, what are we going to do in the interim? And once you've built a facility, once you've built a huge natural gas facility, they don't build it for 3 years. They build it for a minimum of 35 years. And every 35-year facility I've ever seen, people try and stretch it to at least 50 years. So from my standpoint, the argument for fossil fuels is we're doable, we're practical, we can do it today. You need the energy. Stop screwing around. We're the real deal.
And the argument against it, I was just down at the TVA testifying because they're getting ready to build a bunch of gas-fired power plants. The argument against it is, this is insane. A, it wrecks the planet, and B, it's yesterday's technology, and forget 40 years from now, 10 years from now, it's going to look ridiculous, both in terms of its effect on the environment and in its cost. And so the fight is how, I think the entire fight is how quickly we make this happen. 40 years from now, 30 years from now, we're going to run the planet on clean energy of one kind or another because it's just cheap, if nothing else. But if it takes us anything like that long to get there, it's pretty clear that the planet we run on it is going to be a broken planet. So the question is, how do we speed up this transition? Let's talk for a minute, since we're in Washington and since you ran for president, let's talk for a minute about politics, something else you know something about. How does that play into the speed of that transition?
Well, the name of the book is Cheaper, Faster, Better, meaning that we're going to win in the marketplace on the merits. And so the question in all of this is how that's going to get measured. And if it gets, the point I was trying to make is the argument for fossil fuels is availability, practicality, we can do it right now. Now, it may be a bad decision in 3 years, Bill. And it may be a 50-year decision, but once it's built, people are going to want to use all of those facilities. So from my standpoint, the question is, how do we get the people who are going to be buying the electricity to understand that they're going to be responsible for their footprint? I don't believe that we're going to get this done in another way. The way that we're going to win this, in my mind, is by convincing the buyers that in 3 years, if you're buying dirty electricity, you are going to be the person who's on the hook for the implications of that, for the cost of that. And let's just take one step back just for a little refresher course. I know you guys miss Econ 101, so I thought it'd be a great time to remind you how fun that all was. I mean, this is a really simple question at its root, which is people didn't know they were polluting when they started using fossil fuels. And in fact, the standard of living in the United States and the world is incredibly highly correlated with energy usage. incredibly highly correlated. And that has meant really since 1800 that it's about the use of fossil fuels and the standard of living around the world for human beings. What they didn't realize is, oh, by the way, we're polluting. And as I like to laugh, like CO2, you've never seen it, you've never smelled it, you've never touched it. So what's the big deal? Nobody knew. But it turns out that it's causing something that is destabilizing the natural world in a way that is discernible, provable, and everybody knows it's true. But if you've been polluting for 200 years without paying for it, you kind of like it. And it's a lot of money. And so if you think about how much money the pollution costs, just to put a number on it, I mean, this is the whole point, is like people are polluting for free. If they had to pay for their pollution, everything would be fine. We just work it out. So here's the numbers. They'll be a little rough estimates, but 42 gigatons of CO2 per year, 42 billion tons of CO2. The US government has said that the cost to society of a ton of CO2 is $190. Okay, so it's like $7 to $8 trillion a year of free pollution. Now that's not free to the world, it's free to the producers. The world is paying the price. You can ask the people of Pakistan, you can ask the people in Mumbai, you can ask the people in Key West, are they paying a price? They are paying a price. There is a cost to pollution. It's just separated between the people who are polluting and the people who are suffering. And so when if that were, this is a simple thing, if that were included, we'd solve this very, very quickly. But politically,
Impossible.
how are we going to get this done? And that my point is, we're going to do it in the marketplace because we're going to win in spite of that. We are going to invent stuff. We have invented stuff. We have to push it out, and we then have to measure what's going on so that people understand their responsibilities, and the people who are buying and using it understand where they are. And that's why measurement's so important. That's why disclosure and transparency are so important, so that people understand what they're doing. And I think when we get that fully done, that's the day we really start to make this work.
I think in the meantime, it's super important that we figure out how to slow down. Right? So there's great activists in this room who did a remarkable job last fall figuring out how to get this pause, for instance, on new permitting for LNG, which
and you guys know that Bill was all over.
Turns out to be the biggest greenhouse gas bomb in the world. And the reason that the pause, that what Biden did was so important, and that re-electing Biden so that he can continue that, we hope, in some form or another, is so important, is because if all those Asian countries that they're trying to sell that LNG to go ahead and build out all that infrastructure in the next 3 years, then we're stuck with it for the next 30 years. And that's why you may have read in the Washington Post, that's why all the oil executives were busy meeting with the former president who was demanding, Austin Powers fashion, $1 billion in order. That was the price he set on planet Earth. He said, give me $1 billion and you can do whatever you want to this planet. And the point is that, yes, you're absolutely right. Over time, we're going to do the right thing, but over time doesn't get the job done. If it doesn't happen fast, then the physics of climate change, already out of control, get more out of control. So it's that deep comment. I mean, if we were going to do it entirely by the marketplace, why bother running for president?
Well, to be clear, I really believe, and I think I've actually convinced Bill McKibben, which was no small job, believe me, that the way we get this done from an effective standpoint is by using the capitalist system, which is a serious scaling, building system to get things done. But all capitalism takes place in the framework of rules. The whole idea that there's such a thing as a free market is a fallacy and a joke. Every market has rules, and we're talking about some of them, but I mean, think back to the first markets. There's a rule where the market is. There's a rule when the market opens. There's a rule where you get to put your stall. Every market has rules. God did not set up markets. Human beings set up markets. And so the incentives are driven by the rules. The United States, it used to be completely legal, and we don't even need to go into the worst examples, but it used to be completely legal to hire a 12-year-old for a 14-hour day and pay him a quarter or her a quarter. That was completely legal until some human beings decided that's not really a great thing to do. Let's put some rules around that so you no longer get to abuse kids. So in this case, of course, having the rules and the policies in place so that the incentives are set up for society, not for the producers, is ultimately where we have to get to. But the first step we have to do is win in the marketplace everywhere we can, where we are winning. And the second thing we have to do is get to so many places so that you can look and see as a government, if we put in these rules, it'll still work for the people. Like, you can't say everybody's got to do solar if solar costs 40 cents a kilowatt hour and it's available at 5 cents. You can't do it. So it's really an interactive system within what we can actually do in the real world, what they can insist on. And that interaction is how we're actually going to win. But to me, a huge step in this that people don't talk about is the measurement, the transparency, the broad understanding. So everybody in this room knows, what companies are doing, and they can look and see, and the companies can understand if they want to, but everybody else can look too.
And just to make clear, because I think this is one of the things that's key to Tom's argument, that we need to have a real good calculation of those emissions. The key part of this is this very crucial rule on what are called scope 3 emissions. So if you're a bank, you have to report how much of the money that you're making comes from investing in fossil fuels and the emissions it produces. This rule, even under the Biden administration, we couldn't get through the federal government this year. The SEC punted on it, refused to do it. Happily, with a big campaign, with a lot of good activists, we've been able to get it through in California, which, all things being equal, should be enough, because every big company works in California. If they have to report it there, in many ways, it's as good as having a federal rule. But just to make clear the contingent nature of all of this, and the fact that it takes extraordinary work constantly by activists to set up this situation that produces the rules that allows your magic to do something.
But so I want to put this in a global context, first of all. I'm from California. So when we talk about California transparency, that's something very dear to my heart. And let me say, the people who pushed that through in California were big companies. They're big companies who want the world to be transparent, who think it's good for business, who pushed really hard so that elected officials wouldn't think they were doing something terrible, onerous, destructive, but something positive and important. But let's take a step back for 1 sec, because presumably most of us are Americans, but this is not an American problem. This is a global problem. And so when you think about this problem, and I'm sure most people know this, but I'll just put some numbers on it to be a little more specific. Look, the people who produce the most EVs in the world and buy the most EVs in the world are Chinese. The people who produce the most solar panels and wind turbines in the world are Chinese. The people who develop the most clean energy in the world, renewable energy in the world, are Chinese. They also emit about a third of the CO2 in the world, and their emissions went up 5% last year. Their emissions went up more than the world's emissions went up. So when we think about how this is going to work, and we think about oversight and how we're going to pull a globe together, information is even more important, because at the same time that they're building coal plants, they're selling EVs and solar arrays. And so for us to get this under control, all the growth in emissions projected through 2050 is outside the United States and Europe. All of it. The United States and Europe are expected, they went down each 4% last year. They're expected to go down every year. And that's regardless of which administration is in. In the United States and Europe, we are winning this. We will continue to win this. The question is, how do we pull the whole world into a system that actually works when we know how much new electricity, how much new cement, all the systems that Americans take for granted are going to be built.
And just to put a number on that, just to make it clear that there's nothing automatic about it even here, the best data is that the best study I've seen indicates that a Trump victory worldwide would mean an extra 4 billion tons of carbon over what we would have been releasing otherwise.
I think that might be low.
The equivalent of the annual output of the EU and Japan at the moment.
Well, let's talk about, because if we're going to have international cooperation, if we're going to have to build international institutions, measurement standards, that means countries are going to have to work together. I mean, it seems like, that's kind of obvious. And if you'll remember, we were not part of the Paris Accords between 2017 and 2020. And as a result, I always tease people, but it's like Paris was 2015. Everybody remembers the Paris Accords who knows anything about climate. Glasgow was 2021. Most people who've spent any time thinking about climate also know how much progress was made in Glasgow, Scotland in 2021. But I defy someone in this room to tell me where the international UN conferences on climate were between 2017 and 2020. Because they existed. I mean, Heather knows, and I know, and Bill knows, but nothing happened. And so when we think about the need, where the real emissions are coming from, where the real emissions growth is projected to come from, what we actually have to get under control, international cooperation, where the United States is a critical part of the leadership. I mean, it's not like we dictate to the world, but we are a critical part of the leadership. When we disappeared, it disappeared.
I could happily go on with this conversation for a very long time, because this is
Bill.
rich,
we should open it up to questions.
Rich, deep book. But it's time to let other people have to come, because since we're all on TV, everybody has to come to the microphone, right? There's just this microphone right here, yeah, by the column here. Good. So and do your best to ask a question, one that ends in a question mark, if you have a chance.
You ready to go? Bob Mitchell, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Canyon Mountain. This is a little self-serving, so my apologies. I started the first independent electric transmission company in America. And I would encourage you, and this is the question, have you folks looked at the role of transmission and how important it is to reduce the carbon footprint? Because you can produce a lot of solar and a lot of offshore wind and so on, but if you can't deliver it to where it's needed, it's not usable. And of course, in Central Valley, huge amounts of solar is available. It just can't get out.
So this is a critical point. And anyone who's looking at the United States specifically knows that we have a huge problem with transmission. And that there are a lot of the solar and wind projects that have been announced, right, that people are prepared to build, are having big problems with permits. Right. And then they're having huge problems with being able to get on the grid in a timely and honestly affordable fashion. Right. I think there's a real question about whether we're going to do it by building new grid availability, which I think is the traditional way to think about it. I also think there are new technologies, some of which I talk about in my book specifically, to basically increase the amount of electricity that a given transmission line can hold up to 5x. So one of the things that I think we need to think about, and I think young people are thinking about, and I think technologists are thinking about, is in the United States, it's hard to build stuff. Permits are hard to get. Excuse me?
Today's Washington Post on carbon fiber high voltage line.
Exact. And that's my point is we can do technology, in my mind, in a lot of instances is going to have to figure out how we use the existing footprint because it's so hard to get permits.
Right.
Use the existing footprint so you don't have to get that, and then upgrade it in really substantial ways so we can hold multiples of the electricity.
Well, you're certainly correct. There's a role for both new and what you're talking about with technology. We have a project in California to build a subsea project.
Nope, we've gone past the question mark.
Okay.
I can
Well,
tell. So
I
we
was
got
curious. I was
the
just
only people
curious.
behind us
Just
here.
curious if Tom has heard of it. It's a subsea line to go from Diablo Canyon down to L.A. and deliver renewable energy into the
So
heart of
obviously,
LA.
I'm in favor of that.
Have you
But
heard of
let
that?
me make one point about this, which is generally the point. This is a huge opportunity for us. My point of this book is it's a crisis. It's a bigger crisis than most people understand. We have to solve it, but solving it as a challenge, this is a chance for us to do what America can do. We have everything in our playbook to do this. This is the kind of thing we've traditionally done as a country. It is a chance for us. We can't do it as Democrats or Republicans. We have to do it as across the board Americans, across geographies, across parties, and everything else that divides us. And it's a great challenge for us. It's a great opportunity for us to remember what this country is about and to remember what it's like to win as a country. And that's why I wrote the book, to say, why don't we take that attitude, how to win together and remind ourselves how great it is to be an American.
Looking at the energy demand side, there are revolutions going on in terms of crypto, which has this demand, energy demand for mining, and in AI, which has a high energy demand for computing power. And I'm just wondering how the trends for increased demands coming from these sources, in addition to getting us from place to place and keeping our homes comfortable, will factor into and countervail this source of silver buckshot?
Look, it's a great question. And when we look at it, let's assume instead of 86% of new electricity generation, it's 100%. But if the overall demand is growing so much, the issue with that will be, and I'm simplifying here, and I apologize for that, but if the underlying demand is growing this much, are we really going to retire all those fossil fuel plants, or are we going to keep them in place for 5 years longer because we can't build the renewable capabilities fast enough to both meet the new demand and cut out the fossil fuel plants? It's a huge issue. You know, from our standpoint, there is huge pressure on this system. And that's, you know, one of the big issues is that as AI comes out and as all these data centers are built in this area, you know, how are we going to retire all the fossil fuel plants?
Are we able to quantify that increased demand the way we're able to quantify where your emissions are coming from, for
Yes.
instance?
That part, I do believe, again, let me say this. This is a global problem. The U.S. has a surprising new demand for electricity that will make us less able to retire fossil fuel plants as fast as we'd like. But I do believe that the issue globally, honest to God, is going to turn out to be the most populous countries in the world: China, India, Southeast Asia, and then afterwards, you know, probably Africa. But really the place where we're going to win or lose this is going to be in those places.
Thank you.
So I should say that I worked at the EPA from 1980 to 1986, and it was as a staff attorney, and it was so distressing. I gave up and went to medical school at 40. So say you are the advisor to, say Biden gets reelected, from my lips to God's ear. And he asks you, what do we do about China? I mean, I'm well aware of all those coal plants. We can't, the market doesn't work there. And the coal plants, the coal mines, and the coal plants, what do we do?
And let me just add a codicil to that question. What do you think of
It's like getting punched.
the Biden administration last week said
Yes.
we're not going to let EVs from
Yes.
China into this country?
know.
Good call.
So if you're asking me, is it a good call not to allow a $14,000 plug-in hybrid into the United States of America from an environmental standpoint? Excuse me, could you repeat the question?
Pay off the
I
auto
understand.
workers.
It's that is a
answer.
trade-off between protecting American jobs in the auto industry and I would say definitely the speed with which we move to an electrically driven transportation system. And also, dare I say it, when we're talking about inflation, I think if people are buying $14,000 cars, that does something to the inflation numbers that everyone seems to be so panicked about. So I think that the question there is, I think, a real desire on the part of the administration to protect working people across this country. And that's why they did it.
But what do we do about China?
So here's my point about China. There are, I think in the UN conference on climate, there are like 196 countries. About 20 of them really do about 80% of the emissions. But if we're waiting for 196 countries to pass rules about CO2 emissions and then to enforce them, I think that's going to happen way after the time I'm around.
Right.
My whole point about transparency, now let me say this, I don't know if you guys know this, but the ability to know CO2 emissions in this world from space, from satellites, is incredibly good. I don't know if you guys know this, but there are satellites that on a real-time basis are monitoring, I'm going to get this number wrong, but directionally right, 600 million emission sites in the world. So it's like every power plant, every ship,
But that
every
doesn't
train.
help us with China.
It does. Because the only way we're going to get this under control, the reason I'm such a bug about information is China is using all those plants to export.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole point is, if we know what the emissions, I always say to people, do you know the emissions footprint of your shirt? No, neither does anybody else, including the person who makes the shirt. But if everybody knows exactly what the emissions profile is of this shirt, then we can charge on it. And that's exactly what the EU is going to do, is they're not just going to measure through scope 3. They're going to say there's going to be a border adjustment. It's going to be like, okay, this shirt is representative of however much, and we're going to charge you at the border for that amount. That is the only way that you're going to have an international system where people are responsible for what they're doing.
It doesn't work with Xinjiang. Thanks.
Well, hi, Bill. Hi, Tom. I'm very glad to meet you. First of all, I like your argument because I myself love nature very much. And secondly, I come from the Chinese embassy because I was about to ask the question before the elegant lady just now, but she said since you're from the Chinese embassy, maybe you can ask the question later. So, first of all, I agree that climate change definitely requires international cooperation. And I would say China-US cooperation on climate has always been a bright spot in the bilateral relations. Back at home, we are making big efforts to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. It may sound not as aggressive as the goals of those Western countries, but for us, this is already very ambitious. And you were also talking about new energy vehicles and coal power plants. I just have a personal story. My best friend, when I was in college, her father was laid off because the government closed down many small coal-fired power plants. It was in Hebei province. So we are actually trying strongly to promote new energy, and we are producing, as you said, lots of new energy vehicles. And by the way, 9 out of 10 new energy vehicles in China are sold at home instead of getting exported. So, but in some local provinces, local livelihood relies heavily on coal power industry, on coal industry. So it takes time. And in 2021, we already made the promise of stopping financing coal power plants overseas. And you also met just one
The
last
question mark on the end here, yeah.
Right. One last sentence. You mentioned NASA. Actually, according to NASA statistics, China was the biggest source of the increase of of afforestation globally from 2000 to 2017. So the question now comes, what do you think, especially at the business level, can Chinese and Americans do together to promote technological innovation? Perhaps we can develop some new technologies, or perhaps we can jointly help with energy transition in other developing countries, in Africa, for example. Thank you.
Well, I do think that China, and I said this, is very determined to be the world leader in terms of EVs, very determined, and in fact is the world leader in terms of solar panels, wind turbines, and lots of other technologies, all of which are exportable, and I think from the standpoint of the Chinese economy, of increasing importance. And I think that it's something which the government is very focused on and very determined and competitive about. I will also say that, in fact, and I think there is a lot of cooperation on climate between the US and China, but in my mind, this is why measurement is so important. Because I think when you look at China, the measurement, the promise was that they would peak by 2030. I think people now think they may peak well before 2030, that they'll actually outperform. But I think it's going to be necessary across the board to be able to measure the carbon footprint of things. And I think that it's one thing to say we're building EVs, but if the way you're building EVs is with coal plants, let's just take that into consideration. Like, let's have transparency and let's figure out what things, what the life cycle analysis of all of this production is. And I will say that I did, in fact, look. China came out, and I think they spent a lot of time thinking about it. And I have, a lot of friends who've worked on it, and they promised they'd get to carbon net neutrality by 2060. But if you actually look at how that goes and you go through it, a hell of a lot of that has to do with sequestration and offsets. And so when you really talk about promises, whether they're from an American corporation or a country about net neutrality that's 30 or 40 years out, it's pretty hard to know exactly how it's going to go. I think from my standpoint, I don't know how Bill would feel about this or how anybody else would feel about this. This decade is the decade. It's kind of, if we don't get it right in this decade, we're going to be in a place.
5 years. 5 years. 2030 is
Yeah.
5 years and 6 months away.
It's like the hill is getting higher and we're getting closer to the base, so that it just gets steeper. And that's what I would say about China is like, look, I understand all the good things, but I think we've got to be transparent about this and face the facts.
Let's get at least one more in here. I know we've got
So
to
let me
stop
give
for-
you a background, a context. So I'm a founder and a board member of a thing called Conscious Capitalism. And when you bring up Economics 101, we all agree that that's the framework. Measurement's critical. There's no such thing as externalities. So we could say what we need is a pricing system for externalities, first of all, and then the markets will figure it out. The businesses will figure out if that's a cost. But the most obvious example is the carbon tax. And we're back to this discussion of if companies were charged for their carbon usage in some shape or form, and there was a market, wouldn't that be part of the solution? And then secondly, what would be the other externalities that would follow? Because the better the markets are at pricing those things, and the more we're doing that, the more likely it is it's going to show up on your balance sheet, it's going to show up in your P&L, and you will respond.
That's great. So let me say, there is a really fantastic MIT program where you can change the assumptions about policies and see what happens in terms of economic growth and CO2 emissions. And one of the things you can do is put in a carbon tax at all different prices per ton and see what it does to emissions and see what it does to growth. And I can tell you, if there's one thing in that program that works like that, it is exactly what we're talking
So why aren't we pushing harder?
People
and why
have-
isn't there a carbon tax coming, or isn't it even being
Because-
debated properly?
Because people have pushed incredibly. I mean, some of the best activists in the country at Citizens Climate Lobby spent 10 years pushing incredibly hard for it, and it isn't something that our political system at the moment is capable of yielding. So that's one of the reasons why there's a series of workarounds like this Scope 3 emissions, measurement. And obviously, everyone's known for decades that it makes sense to not allow the oil industry to use the atmosphere as an open sewer for free. But the oil industry has always had enough political power to prevent that from happening. And that's why this next election, among other things, is not because we're going to get a carbon tax, but because I don't think there's any possibility of that getting through our Congress, but because we can keep extraordinary pressure on this industry, like the pressure that Biden started applying with his LNG permit pause. Those are the places where we can make this fight. It's not like people haven't figured this out. Everybody knows the score here, and we've all been working as hard as we can on it for decades. So you take the fights where you have some chance of winning.
And let me say this. If you think about the Inflation Reduction Act, so we all know it's a huge, it's the biggest climate act in American history by many multiples. True. It's kind of a carbon tax on its head. So if you think a carbon tax is charging people for emitting, this is paying people for not emitting. And it's a lot more complicated to do that because you have to figure out all the different places where people are not emitting and try and measure it and then figure out how to pay them. And that's a complicated thing to do. A tax is sort of like, cha-ching. But actually, it was the political workaround to try and make things work. And that's, what the Biden administration figured out, that politics is the art of the possible. This is the best possible thing that they could come up with to try and make it a level playing field so everybody gets to compete and nobody gets an advantage.
And it must be said that the IRA is doing remarkable, remarkable things, probably more remarkable than we would have thought when it was first passed. The money that's being shoveled out the door is extraordinary, and it's being shoveled out in interesting ways. One of the chief shovelers is here today. So many, many thanks for all that shoveling. This is, you guys know better than anybody else, because you live in the company town, what a ridiculous business at some level politics is. And, the fact that there are people like that, or people like Mike Tidwell, who's been able to figure out how to get the state governments around here. This is what it takes, and it's going to take sustained pressure and effort on every front for the next 5 years. And we don't know if that's good enough, because while we're doing this, the Antarctic is busily melting. So I know that we're sort of out
Bill,
of
let me
time
say
here,
this.
but Tom, you take the
We
last
are
word
going
here.
to win.
All right.
When I wrote this book, because I know we're going to win. The question is how fast.
Yep.
We are going to win. Texas has tripled its solar. Texas, we are winning in the marketplace right now at a rate that people do not understand because we're better.
But since winning slowly is a different way of losing, let's make sure that we win fast, fast, fast. That means, among other things, this book is really, really, you can tell how interesting and different it is from a lot of what we've read and thought. Take it and absorb it and get a sense of it. Tom's done us a real favor here. And you'll go and sign books now, yes? You're happy
But I want to say one
sign
more
books?
thing. You guys, look, we all know the world can be a tough place, and we know that this is a tough problem, and it's a desperate problem, and it's a true crisis. I spend all my time on this. I've spent all my time on this. I feel lucky to be able to do that. I feel like it's I definitely feel lucky that I get to do that. But I also feel as if, we are going to do this together, that this is exactly what we're called to do, that we've been in tough places before. There's nothing that said, 25,000 years ago, we'd be in a cave somewhere worried about what was outside, whether it was somebody who wanted to kill us or wild animals or just a terrible, storm. And I think this is a real chance for us. This is an absolute wonderful opportunity for us to redefine ourselves and prove what we can do. And that is us overcoming difficulties, human spirit overcoming troubles. And that's what I care about, and that's what we're called on to do.